John Funn, editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal. How do you see the presidential campaign at this moment in history?
I don't think it's over quite yet. I think Bill Clinton has more or less wrapped up the nomination, but I think Jerry Brown is going to bloody him for the next 3 or 4 months.
How would you rate this campaign as campaigns go?
Actually fairly substantive. I mean, when you have 5 candidates producing their own 90-page booklets on how to repair the economy, that's real meat.
Christopher and Alexander Hitchens. Good morning.
Good morning. Spring break.
Now, what is going on here? What are you two doing together?
He's fed up of just seeing his daddy on TV. He wants to...
He wants to be on TV?
He wants to be on TV.
This is spring break at school?
This is spring break, and this is for all the teachers who thought that they wouldn't have to see him today, because I know that, like all serious people, they're C-SPAN watchers. He's back. Okay.
Now, what does he think? Does he have... do you want to tell us what you think of the campaign? Are you watching the presidential campaign?
Sometimes.
Who's your favorite candidate?
No promptings.
Alexander, do you have a favorite candidate?
Yeah.
Who?
Governor Brown.
Governor Brown.
Who's your least favorite candidate?
Bush.
Very good.
I see. Well, thank you. Thank
see.
you for coming. We'll check in with you later. And now, Mr. Hitchens.
PC kid.
Why were you whispering in your child's ear? Is he not able to make up his own mind?
No, you noticed the Bush was unprompted completely. It's depressing for the customers to begin by agreeing with the Journal and so on, but I think that's exactly right. I think it's amazing that people are telling the residents of New York City, of the great state of California, of this very jurisdiction where we're sitting, D.C., who haven't voted yet, why have an election? We already have a candidate for you. And I'm sure there's a lot of resistance to this. And I also agree that Governor Brown is going to be the beneficiary of it. So this is a terrible way to kick off, isn't it?
Great minds think alike.
Let me go, though, to an international story this morning as a way of getting your feelings about what's going on around the world. The headline of the Washington Post I'm looking at, I'll show the audience in a moment, is Socialists Crushed in France. Anti-foreigner right environmentalists make election gains. Have you looked at this election, and what does it mean, if anything, for this country?
Well, it means the Socialist Party has been in power for too long, almost 10 years, and the voters are exacting some revenge. But remember, this is not the election that determines the French government. It determines the regional and provincial governments. So people are free to cast a protest vote, which is why you see the ecologists and Jean-Marie Le Pen's anti-immigrant party doing very well. They would not do quite as well in a national election that would determine the government.
Do you still consider yourself a socialist?
Yes, I do.
What do you think when you see the socialists only getting 20% of the vote in France and the Jean-Marie Le Pen group getting 14%?
Well, I mean, partly because I'm a socialist, I can't stand François Mitterrand or his choice of prime minister, and I think it's a verdict on that. I mean, when I look at Mitterrand, I see the guy actually who murdered the crew of the Greenpeace vessel in New Zealand, for example. I mean, who's always placed his own ego and the sacred ego of French national interest above any consideration of principle. I wish that was why he was losing. I'm afraid it's not. I think it's obviously true that there's a new frontier being created in Europe, a Mediterranean frontier, which separates southern Europe, the southern flank of the common market, from the northern tier of Africa. And it's becoming a zone of contestation, and people talk about it as if it was a frontier, not unlike the Rio Grande, on a giant scale.
Will the election on April the 9th in Great Britain have any impact on American politics, or will be any indication of which way this country will go?
Yes. I think they've tracked each other pretty closely over the years. I think if Labor wins, and it's ahead by 1 or 2 points in the polls now, there's a very good chance that the Democrat would beat Bush. In any event, both elections are going to be very, very close.
What do you think?
Well, I think there's always been a zeitgeist effect of the British election, and obviously, very noticeably in '79, Thatcherism made Reaganism just look, I hate the word, but more electable. I promise I will not use that word again today, but it showed that you could run a successful populist campaign from the right. The Conservatives didn't have to pretend to be centrists, get elected. And I think that did have a boosting effect on Reagan. I don't actually think Kinnock would have a very boosting effect on anyone. But I think the defeat of post-Thatcherism might be a warning to the post-Reaganites that it's quite difficult to remake a conservative administration.
Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, was in town over the weekend, had a press conference with the president in the East Room. Some say he endorsed the president's re-election in a kind of a roundabout way, saying how well he had done in foreign affairs. What does that mean?
I just think that German leaders like Leaders all over Europe admire stability. They like the guy who's in there now. They don't like the unknown. And so Kohl is just going with that which is familiar. No news there.
Dear, oh dear, I'm afraid that's true. I agree. Though, I mean, I think it deserves to be said, perhaps this early in the show, that this giving to Bush, of all the credit about foreign policy, of saying, okay, let's let him have that, fine, now let's get on with discussing politics, is a real sign of underdevelopment, don't you think? I mean, for one thing, it avoids him having to ever answer any questions about a foreign policy that's distinctly iffy.
Bush has been the beneficiary of a great deal of luck, but he's played those cards fairly well, with the exception of completely missing the boat on the rise of nationalism in Eastern Europe and Russia and the other republics. He was way behind on that, and frankly, he was extremely lucky that Gorbachev left office as quietly as he did. Yeltsin managed to fill that gap. It could have blown up in his face. That famous Chicken Kiev speech of last year was a disgrace, and he's lucky that everyone has forgotten it.
Symbols and photographs are always interesting. Here's the Washington Times, and here's a photograph from yesterday. You see three well-known national candidates there. Christopher Hitchens, what comes to mind when you see that?
Which way is Jesse leaning, I suppose, is the sort of hidden subtext of the photograph.
Whose idea do you think that is? That they all three get together?
It's clever enough for it to be Jackson's idea, I think. Clever in the sense of, you know, image politics. I mean, he's in a position at the moment where Governor Brown has said he would consider him as a running mate, and Governor Clinton is, for the moment, running as the friend of the black American. And with New York coming up, I imagine he's able to pretty much name his price. I have a feeling, though, that he's worth less as a symbol than he once was. I think he's disappointed a lot of his supporters very greatly.
John Funn, when you see this photograph, what comes to mind?
I think it's Jesse Jackson taking bids for his support. And it's also a way of showing that Bill Clinton and Jesse Jackson get along just fine, despite Governor Clinton's outburst when he was mistakenly informed that Jackson had endorsed another candidate.
Which I'd forgotten, right. And despite the fact also that Mr. Governor Clinton was found to play golf at an all-white club in Arkansas, which I must say I think is astounding for someone who's been a governor of a state like that for that long. And then to say, oh yeah, now I think about it, that's a mistake, as if it hadn't occurred to him before, is pretty depressing too. But there seems to be a Teflon character to Governor Brown. It's Governor Clinton, which means these sort of things don't get held against him. I said Brown because you're just holding up the front of the New York Times with him on the cover.
I was looking for a photograph. One of those papers this morning has a picture of Governor Clinton at the golf club last week.
Ah.
And this is a front page story in the New York Times this morning. It says, Brown in New York assails Clinton with a new ferocity.
And that was about the golf club, among other things, wasn't it?
It's about a lot of things.
I am astonished at how people in the Democratic establishment have taken a figure like Governor Brown and vilified him. I certainly think he's eccentric. I certainly think he's occasionally irresponsible in his rhetoric. He certainly is a consummate political opportunist. But he is a legitimate candidate. And for Democratic officials to call him, quote, the political equivalent of a drive-by shooting, unquote, is a bit unfair. I think he does have a distinct political program from Governor Clinton, and I think it's a mistake for Democrats to belittle him, because I think a lot of his voters might sit home in the fall.
Front page of the New York Times yesterday. There's another photograph I want to ask you both about. Mr. Hitchens.
Doesn't he look adorable? Don't they both look adorable? Buchanan and Nixon.
Yes.
Well, everyone else seems to ask President Nixon's advice on everything. Why shouldn't Buchanan? At least with Buchanan, the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree.
Mr. Funn.
I think it's appropriate. I think it's Buchanan looking for some stature. I think it reminds people that he's worked for at least 2 presidents. But Buchanan is now running for 1996. He's not running for this year. And that's obvious.
Before we leave that Brown photograph, I'll just say, great predecessor of mine at Harper's, the late Walter Karp, used to say that the Democratic Party hacks, the machine people, would rather lose the election, consciously rather lose the election than lose their control over the Democratic Party. And I think that's true. And I think this is why they say unpardonable things about Brown. I mean, the line of the day now is that he's a political terrorist, or he's an absurd, a bomb thrower. A preposterous thing to say. Not at all like the insults, the political insults that they are so wounded about when Mr. Brown launches them at Mr. Clinton.
They treat him more harshly than they would treat President Bush, which is astonishing.
By the way, there's a piece in yesterday's New York Times right below that picture, and the headline is, "New kind of Potomac fever is caused by Spartan living." And there's some quotes. Did you happen to see that? Maureen Dowd wrote it. There's some quotes in there from Tom Korologos, a Republican lobbyist, said, "Why not just go to Salt Lake City and open a gas station?" Jack Brooks, a cigar-chomping veteran Texas congressman, said he was not enmeshed in the House banking affair, but that he was disgusted with what he sees as the sanctimonious tone of the debate on privilege. "There is a move afoot to destroy the Congress as we know it," he drawled. "In the future, the kind of people who run for Congress will be coming up here living in sleeping bags and sleeping in their offices and riding bicycles to work."
He drawled all that, did he? I'm impressed. As if to say, you know, I mean, here I am as a congressman sacrificing everything for you, and I don't even get to cash my, you know, checks wherever I like.
John White, the former Democratic National Committee chairman, says you might as well be in Des Moines. What's that mean? What's all this mean?
This just shows there is a complete gulf between the thinking in the Beltway and the thinking in the with the American people. 80% of the American people want to destroy Congress as we know it, and Jack Brooks still hasn't gotten that message.
Mr. Hitchens?
I think Brooks is right in saying there is an anti-congressional demagogic mood around, and all kinds of people are trying to cash in on it, and I think that's depressing.
Harper's, your magazine, right here on the front page, an article by Christopher Hitchens. What's this all about?
It's about how the opinion poll racket, the opinion poll industry, has tried to substitute for a democracy. It's tried to substitute for the electoral process.
When did you write it?
I finished it just before the New Hampshire primary results.
How did you study the opinion polling process?
Well, I went to New Hampshire and I compared the various polling processes up there. I talked to some former pollsters, noticeably Pat Caddell, who used to be Mr. Democrat in the 70s and 80s and used to be, it was thought, able to elect practically anyone. And then I conducted a poll of my own in New Hampshire by lifting the telephone and dialing people at random and trying to fill out the questionnaire that pollsters use. And I found that most voters' answers were too intelligent for the sort of questions that polls are made up of.
Is the electorate manipulated by polls?
Yes. The people who invest all this money in polling are not doing it for nothing. They're not doing it just to find out what people think. They're doing it to try and influence what people think. Who would spend all that money just to find out what was going on? They want to be able to predict it, and they want to be able, therefore, to mold it. So it's an intervention in the political process. And as we were saying a little earlier, you notice how the consensus at the moment is we don't need any more elections. We've already got a candidate. Now, that was being said about Bill Clinton on the basis of polling before one vote had been cast in New Hampshire.
But the most important poll is the poll of the press corps. When Hendrik Hertzberg went up and he conducted his traditional poll of the press corps in New Hampshire, he interviewed 4 reporters. Every single one said their candidate was Clinton. An astonishing degree of unanimity, even for PAC journalism. Does that kind of poll lead to these other polls?
In fact, there are two polls, aren't there, that they call the invisible primary, or sometimes called the Beltway primary. There's the money primary and the press primary, and Clinton had both of those locked up, the fundraising primary particularly, well before the votes were cast. Actually, in New Hampshire, what I found was that even the reporters who weren't for Clinton worked for newspapers or news editors who certainly were, and who didn't want any bad news about him. So they may have been annexed in that way. But yes, it's extraordinary how the invisible primary decides before any front runner emerges.
Do you like polls? I mean, for instance, Christopher Hitchens writes about the Wall Street Journal NBC poll here and how they used to have Bob Teeter, who is running the campaign for George Bush, and on the other side, a Democrat, Peter Hart, and that he points out that, you know, that Al Hunt, the bureau chief here, is a friend of both of them, and you tell us why. Why'd you point that out? What was the reason?
Well, I point out that, I mean, it used to be the case that newspapers would wonder, should we commission our own opinion poll? The New York Times used to wonder this particularly. If we do, should we report it as news on the front page, if it's our poll and we've paid for it? And should we put a reporter's byline on it? These were considered ethical questions. Now, no newspaper would think twice about doing anything of the sort. I gave the Journal as an example because it seemed like, you know, you have the perfect bipartisan instance of Bush's pollster, Mondale's former pollster, so you've got the two-party racket there. Then a very powerful bureau chief who's often on TV and very much a molder of the consensus. And then finally, a set of findings which I thought were contradicted by the alienation question that the Journal had asked, which was to the target force of likely Reagan Democrat voters. Do you or do you not think, went the question, that the institutions of the country are rigged against people like yourself? And the answer was nearly 60% said yes to that, which is a bit of a verdict on the consensus.
Mr. Fun, what about the Journal and its poll?
My favorite poll is the exit poll, because it's taken after people vote. And I wish they wouldn't be reported or hinted at early in network broadcasts. I think that kind of poll has very valuable information. I think a lot of the other polls ask simplistic questions, and they don't properly evaluate voters' sophisticated answers. I agree with Mr. Hitchens. As for the Journal, I'll simply say that I think most of our polling results are reported in a fairly sophisticated way, and at least we don't use banner headlines.
Last Monday, when we started this program out, there was a little tiny ad on the front page of the New York Times, about a three-liner, and it said, if you want, I don't have it here this morning, but if you want Ross Perot to be your president, call the following number. And we called that number, and the gentleman on the other end of the line, we didn't know who it was a fellow by the name of Kurt Koenig, and we've got him back on the line this morning. Before I asked Kurt a question this morning, last week was one of those weeks in this town when Ross Perot came, talked to everybody and left. Conquered and left. On the front page of the Washington Post, there are two stories here. Up here it says, key November voters sitting out primaries. Then if you go right down below it, there's a piece that says, Perot awaits groundswell. Before I ask Mr. Koenig how he feels about all this stuff, what do you two gentlemen think of Ross Perot?
I think that he is one of the most skillful non-politicians I've ever encountered. I think he's playing this like a true professional. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. I think he is waiting for the groundswell. And if it doesn't show up, he's gotten 2 or 3 weeks of media attention, sort of like what Governor Cuomo was doing last year when he was in the presidential race, out of the presidential race. I think he's far more political than he lets on.
Mr. Hitchens.
The traditional question used to get asked to people on the left was, if you're so smart, how come you're not rich? This question clearly cannot be asked to Mr. Perot, so that's a head start. I was listening to a Gordon Liddy call-in show in a cab the day that Perot came to Washington.
Town.
Yeah, the day that Perot came to Washington, and there were a lot of people saying, well, but isn't it funny how Perot goes on so much about the federal deficit? You wouldn't expect him to be so upset about that, but he'd apparently made a particularly stern set of statements about that. So I thought, well, maybe I hadn't listened particularly before. I thought maybe he isn't the typical businessman politician. In other words, I mean, I'm in the process of finding out what I think about it.
But you know, to every answer, to every question about a problem, he says you have to look at it like an engineer. You have to sit it down, strip down all of its parts, examine it, put it back together again, come up with 2 or 3 options, have this electronic town hall meeting, and let the American people decide. That's not an answer to a question. That's an evasion.
Kurt Koenig, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Good morning. I want to quote something from this morning's Washington Post that you probably haven't seen. Quote, I've never done anything political before, said Kurt Koenig, 34, a financial manager in New York public relations firm who has established a draft Perot committee in his state. I've always been too disgusted. Is that an accurate quote from you?
That is an accurate quote.
What has happened to you since we last talked to you last Monday morning?
The phones have been ringing off the hook day and night. I haven't even had a chance to get the numbers that came in yesterday, with the one day that I did take off to be with my family. Get the names and addresses. There have been a number of people calling with sincere, heartfelt desire to do something to help their country, and they think Mr. Perot presents that opportunity.
Now, I apologize. Last week we cut you off inadvertently, and I hope you understand that it wasn't on purpose. I was starting to ask you some questions, and either one of our guests here can certainly jump in on this. Who started this? You live in Westchester County, New York, right?
Yes, sir.
Who started? Did you start this, or did Mr. Perot call you and say, set up a committee?
No, by no means did Mr. Perot contact me directly. I started it when I had heard his Larry King Live show and had faxed over a copy of what eventually turned out to be that little reader's notice ad in the New York Times, and had asked for some kind of an approval from him, and did not hear back from them at all, so wasn't sure how to proceed at that point.
Are there any other, I mean, are you trying to sign up for the general election? I mean, actually get the signatures to put him on the ballot?
We can't start in New York State until July 7th to start petitioning. So at this point, we're creating an organizational structure that can increase the awareness of the voters, and also get the volunteers on hand to make the 20,000 necessary signatures an easy task.
Go ahead.
Kurt, I wanted to ask you, has anyone investigated the 50 state election laws and found out how likely it is that Mr. Perot could get on all 50 state ballots by November?
There is a group of guys who've formed up in Washington, again, on their own, and they've apparently have on hand all of the Board of Election laws from each of the 50 states. As I understand it, there is a very good chance that he'll make the ballot in all 50 states. That is actually the easy task. In New York, where we need 20,000, we're shooting for 50. We want to make sure everything's done the way it's supposed to be. That isn't so difficult. A lot of voters are just disenchanted, and they're not voting in the primaries. Of course, in most states, if you vote in a primary, you can't sign a petition. You're disallowed from voting for another candidate. But nevertheless, the number of people who are staying away from the primaries and who just don't see a choice here are out there waiting for this choice, and we just have to make them aware of it.
Now, where do you get your money to make this thing happen and pay for your telephones that people are calling in on?
Well, so far, it's been out of our pockets. We're not soliciting funds, people who have offered us funds, and yes, there are people out there who want to make donations, large and small. We haven't been taking any of it. When money is offered, we've asked for supplies. We've asked for toner for the copy machine. We've asked for paper for the copy machine, things of that nature.
People want to send you money.
People want to send money, yes. A lot of people don't want, people think of politics as, well, I make a donation. This is not the kind of investment we want in this. We want a sweat investment that'll commit the voters to this effort, because it's very important that we're all still with Mr. Perot after he becomes Mr. President. Without us in his corner, as he says, without us being there to be his power base when he's facing Congress and special interests, he doesn't stand a chance.
So it can't be too early to ask you this. What's the main point of his program?
The main point of his program, I think it was John, or no, it was you. So, I'm sorry,
Christopher.
That made a questioned earlier why his concentration on the deficit and deficit spending is such a big part of his platform. Is his main thing is that what makes that a real problem isn't that we're $4 trillion in debt, but that the way our country's been run, the tax base, the wage earners are eroding, and that will continue to happen unless something is done in Washington to turn it around. That is his main focus. That is what he wants to, first of all, stop the erosion and then get it to start growing again, where we can start increasing the tax rolls and paying for all these wonderful things, buying the way to utopia is another way he
Kurt
put it.
Koenig, have you talked it now with any official Perot staff person now in Dallas?
I've spoke to a volunteer who was, at first I was calling Perot's office directly, just hoping to get some kind of approval or guidance. I didn't, felt that just to go off and shooting my own mouth off and saying whatever I felt was necessary to get it done. In some way, I wanted to have some kind of guidance. There was very little offered. There is now a volunteer whose number I call, who primarily just gives me names of people who have called him, who have written into Perot's office, so that I can continue to build my force of volunteers. Outside of that, there's practically nothing else we've got.
What's your telephone number up there so that if people want to get a hold of you again, they can call you?
212-730-1202.
All right, we'll give that to the audience again just for the fun
I just
of
had
it.
one more question for Kurt. Kurt, a lot of people who back Ross Perot certainly admire his financial ability and his straight talk, and I'll grant them that. But to what extent do you or the people around him know his views on other issues besides the deficit? Abortion, what federal programs he would cut to reduce the deficit?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think first of all, in terms of the deficit, what he hasn't spoke so specifically about
That's
cutting.
the problem.
He hasn't spoke about cutting programs so much as he's talked about cutting out waste. For instance, in terms of taxes, the tax system we have in this country, the tax laws we have, are very antagonistic to doing good business in this country. If you were to compare them to other countries, it's almost like we don't want businessmen.
I've done it again. I cannot believe it. Kurt, we'll get you back, and I'm sorry. For some reason or other, it's just jinxed.
Just when we were getting to the meat.
Just when we're getting to the meat. We'll get you back on the line, and we'll talk some more about this before it's over. And I'm sorry, that number up there where Kurt Koenig is located is 212-730-1201. Did you hear something that you want to comment on?
It always makes me suspicious when, you have these apolitical businessmen saying, well, I just want to, put the country back on its feet and restore incentives and so forth. There's something, frankly, I think, sinister about it, unless the guy's prepared to say a great deal more about what his political opinions are. For example, has he ever voted before, and for whom? I'd like to know, because it's much too easy, this talk, if the country can be run like USA Inc., with a real can-do guy. There's a whiff of fascism to that, I think.
Let me ask you.
What Perot reminds me of is sort of a Japanese politician. He doesn't answer any questions specifically. He doesn't have a specific program. He just talks about efficiency, can-do spirit, appeals to patriotism, all of which sounds fine. But there's no program. Yes, but there's no program.
You have an editorial in the Wall Street Journal this morning, and the headline is "Tsongas's Money Ceiling." What's the point?
The point is that I think the public financing laws, which have governed presidential elections since 1976, have had unintended consequences. Eugene McCarthy, when he ran in 1968, did it on Stuart Mott's money and the money of a few idealists. He had a lot of small donors, but basically, when the campaign was about to have the phone plugs pulled out of the wall, there was some idealist there who could write a check, keep the campaign going. McCarthy went on to win 42% in New Hampshire. He knocked Lyndon Johnson out of the race in 1968, went on to contest the other primaries with Bobby Kennedy, and I think has gone down in American history as a very credible, inspiring candidate. That kind of candidate is much more difficult to run in these days. Paul Tsongas ran. He could only take up to $1,000. Any idealist who wanted to give him money was prevented from doing that, and I think it crippled his campaign. And I think that's one of the reasons why he had to drop out.
Well, I just thought it was astounding that a candidate, former senator, a person of some stature at any rate, can dump his political campaign and openly say it's because I've run out of dough, and everyone say, oh, well, in that case, we quite understand. It seemed to me a grotesque way to announce the end of your campaign, and I also thought a contemptible one. Contemptible in the way it was received, too.
It was honest, though. That's exactly what did happen.
Well, it was truthful. I don't know about honest. I mean, it was at any rate true. I mean, sure. But, again, it mustn't sound as if we're all in a fan club here, but I mean, that hasn't prevented Governor Brown from keeping a campaign on the road.
But the difference between Governor Brown...
426-1112, I think, is the number, by the way, for Brown.
Well, I favor that.
426-1112. That's the 800 number. Yeah, we are...
800, raising money from 800 number is better than raising it in some salons, I'll agree. But the difference between Governor Brown and Senator Tsongas was that Governor Brown had two well-financed presidential bids before this one. He started with the highest name ID of any of the candidates running, and therefore he was able to get away with the $100 contribution limit. Senator Tsongas, who was barely known outside of his home state of Massachusetts, didn't have that advantage, and I think the lack of money crippled him.
But the way that it affects political discourse seems extraordinary to me, and I've been doing it for a long time, but I still get shocked. I was in New Hampshire the week that Mr. Clinton hit the bricks. I mean, they had a lot of trouble that week, woman trouble mainly. And people were saying, oh, his poll numbers might even fall, which is the second worst thing that can happen to you, because if the opinion polls don't like you, it's like not being liked by rich people almost. So we were all clustered around his press secretary, a woman called Dee Dee Myers, and she said, no, everything's fine. Last week we raised $1.5 million. And I thought, now for most people that seems like a logical answer. But to people looking in at the campaign, that doesn't seem like a logical answer.
We've got to go to the phones, and here's a style section today in the Washington Post, and you can see a big story about Bill Clinton's movers and shakers, and you just mentioned Dee Dee Myers, and her picture is right here. She's the press secretary for Bill Clinton. And we go to our first phone call. By the way, Kurt Koenig's line is now busy, and so we can't get a hold of him, so we'll get him back later. Oregon, Illinois, you're our first caller for our two guests, John Fund, editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, and Christopher Hitchens, columnist for The Nation. I'm sorry, you still write for The Nation?
Sure, yeah.
And also Washington bureau chief of Harper's Magazine. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning to you, and good morning to your guest, Brian.
Morning.
My observation this morning concerns the Ross Perot candidacy, or what I presume will be a candidacy, and I'll help you out with a telephone number. I called Perot's office in Texas last week after you had the interview with him. I believe it was on Wednesday night, and as a result of that telephone call, and another one that I made to the New York number, to Kurt Koenig, I did receive an 800 number. And that 800 number is manned by volunteers, as I understand it, and I believe that they're getting as many as 1,000 telephone calls per hour to that 800 number. And the 800 number is 685-7777. And we have started in a very informal way, unsupported by anyone in terms of funds or even guidance from the Perot company here in Illinois, to investigate everything that we need to do to get his name on the ballot in Illinois. And it's my understanding we need 25,000 signatures by August the 3rd. Again, I'm not running the campaign myself in Illinois, but it's just a series of people telephoning one another informally and trying to get all of the arrangements completed that are necessary to have that done.
All right, because we've got to move on quickly, we've got a lot of calls to get in. Give us one reason why you think Mr. Perot ought to be president.
Credibility, integrity, and ability to lead the American people and get some degree of confidence in his presidency from the American people.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hitchens?
Do you notice how he said that as if he'd thought of it all himself? I mean, that's like plugging a cassette in. That's just what you'd get if you asked someone why they were for Clinton or for Bush. It's no criticism of our customer, our viewer, but I mean, people start talking like that, don't they? They say credibility as if everyone knew what it meant. They say the American people while they're marking time and sort of playing for time, and then they say we had everything in that except electability. I think it's quite extraordinary. No politics at all. I mean, increasingly it is an utterly depoliticized.
This is the cover of Newsweek magazine, John Fund. As I hold it up, by the way, this is I don't know if you can't tell what this looks like, but yeah, you can see the shine there. It's a lacquered cover. Is this new for Newsweek?
No, it's the way they feel about Clinton. I think it's just completely moist.
It's the most flattering photograph I think the man has ever taken. It's quite remarkable.
What do you think of the caller and Mr. Perot, what he said about it?
Again, I don't want to agree with Chris all the time, but he's right. Perot has character and integrity, yes, but he has no political program. In fact, I think his entire political strategy is to be all things to all people, just to do it in a tough-talking, straight-talking way that makes it appear as if he's dealing honestly with questions. But try to pin him down on an issue. Try to pin him down on this waste, fraud, and abuse. I must say, that is the single most disingenuous answer to a question I've ever heard. You know, the federal government, the federal budget is filled with waste, fraud, and abuse, and we have to cut it out. That is not an answer. That's an evasion.
St. Louis, Missouri, you're next.
Yeah, first about Ross Perot, two things. He has always been an independent. I watched him on the C-SPAN repeat yesterday. He's always voted independent. In one stance he did take, he is pro-right for women. He did make that statement.
Abortion rights.
Pardon me?
You mean abortion rights?
Yeah, he's for women's rights, the right to choose.
What do you, I mean, where are you headed in this campaign right now? Who do you like?
Well, I've been Clinton, but if Perot gets in, I think I'll go with Perot, depending more outcome.
What would be your main reason? Here's the cover of U.S. News. Whoops, this is my morning. The rise of Bill Clinton. What would be your reason for going over from Bill Clinton?
That looks more like him.
Be quite frank, I really like Clinton in that, but God, I don't know. If it come down to it, I'd vote for Clinton. But if Perot got in and really made a serious effort, I'd switch in a heartbeat to Perot.
Mr. Fund?
I think he'll take about 60% of his votes from George Bush and about 40% from Bill Clinton. But a fair number of those people probably wouldn't have voted anyway. I think, just like John Anderson in 1980, the bloom will be off this rose by October or November. If he actually gets on the ballot in all 50 states and runs, he'll end up with about between 6 and 8% of the vote. But, you know, it'll certainly make the campaign more interesting.
No opinion yet.
Palmdale, California, you're next.
Yes, I'm interested with what Christopher Hitchens feels about Jerry Brown's value-added tax, and then there's another point, too. I hear socialists on the parliamentary debates on C-SPAN talk about the value-added tax, and they seem to be opposed to it, that it's a hidden tax, And the ordinary person doesn't know how much he's paying, doesn't realize what a disproportionate share of the tax he's paying. And also there's the flat rate tax, and some of the some liberals seem to be opposed to Jerry Brown's flat rate tax. Also, another thing about Jerry Brown are his statements that he made about abortion. I have a 1989 article from the Los Angeles Times that remarked that he told an interviewer for the Catholic News Service that abortion is killing the unborn, and he concluded that abortion was crazy, and it showed how we've organized society to be anti-life. And he went further. He supported freeing Joan Elizabeth Andrews from a Florida prison where she had been serving a 5-year sentence for her part in storming a Pensacola abortion clinic and damaging equipment. And Susan Estrich, who was Michael Dukakis's campaign manager, said that she's been just stunned with the reversal of Jerry Brown on fundraising.
All right, thanks. Mr. Hitchens?
Well, in order. On the tax issue, look, I think the charm of the 13% flat tax proposal is not really either its percentage or its economic implications, because it certainly would have to be adjusted for regressivity by things like value-added tax and different kinds of deduction. I think its appeal is political. Its appeal is to people who feel that they never know where they stand with the IRS, who are always slightly apprehensive, who can always at any minute find they've broken a rule didn't know existed. And this is a foul relationship for citizens to have with the state, and it would be emancipating simply to make it simple and understandable, and also would be very, very emancipating as well as very satisfying to dismiss from their offices the enormous class of loophole artists and accountants and special interest lawyers and so on, and drones and bureaucrats who'd have to go to work, for the first time in their lives, and not just live off the tax code. So I'm sure that it's a political question rather than an economic one in many people's minds. And when people say, well, it isn't progressive, nor is the present tax system, so what can you lose? Now, on the abortion thing, have we got time, or am I droning on too much?
Go ahead. We got a caller waiting, but just go ahead.
Well, I understood Jerry Brown to say that he himself would never consent to take part in or be a partner to or party in an abortion, but that he wouldn't extend that judgment beyond the private sphere, that he was for a woman's right to choose. As to the fundraising point, I think the whole point about him must be, if he's genuine at all, that he is running as someone who used to think one thing and now thinks another. So when people say, but you used to be a great fundraiser, I don't see where the irony comes in. That's the whole point. The point is he's been there, he's seen what it's like, he knows that what the establishment offers you isn't worth having, it's a bribe not worth taking. That means he can't be bought. Ask yourself if you can say that of any other candidate who's running.
Our two guests, Christopher Hitchens, he's from Portsmouth, England originally, and John Fund, a native of Sacramento, California. Let's go to Whitefield, New Hampshire. Thanks for waiting.
Good morning. How are you doing today?
Fine, sir. How are you?
Just a word to Mr. Fund and Mr. Hitchens. Is it the word apolitical is being tossed around a lot. You know, we're all apolitical, all of us who own the country, and we want one of our own to run the country. I mean, to insist that this Mr. Perot doesn't have a program, well, you know, we can say, well, Mr. Bush has a program, Congress has a program. These programs haven't worked. We want to try one of our own, one of our apolitical guys. Let's put them in there and see what they can do.
Caller, did you vote in the primary in New Hampshire?
I did.
And who'd you vote for?
Pat Buchanan.
And what do you think of the situation now? If you had a choice between George Bush, Governor Clinton, and Ross Perot, just for talking purposes, who would you vote for?
I'd have to go with Perot, even though I don't think abortion is an issue, and he did come out saying that he believes in a woman's choice. But it's her decision. But just, I think the economy is got to be the big issue here, and he seems to be the man with the brains when it comes to that. He has the track record.
Mr. Fund.
Well, again, I'm all in favor of apolitical people too. But when you get to Washington and when you become president, you have to deal with the Congress, you have to get through a legislative program, and those are the facts of life. And Ross Perot, for all of his competence in business, is carefully sidestepping any of the real fundamental issues. He has great buzzwords. He talks about patriotism. He talks about reducing the deficit. He talks about waste, fraud, and abuse. But that is not a program. He's trying to be all things to all people in a very skillful way. He's pretending to be forthright and honest when he's actually being evasive.
Next call is from Puerto Rico. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, it seems that watching the mainstream press following this campaign, that they're really reluctant to take either a Brown campaign or a Perot campaign seriously. And, you know, I don't know that there would ever be much revenue in advertising and so on for, you know, for television or, you know, the mainstream press if either one of these fellas, you know, are nominated and go into, you know, into an election. And Perot addressed the situation as far as government graft and waste and so on by saying, you know, let's, you know, go ahead and make a study of the situation, find out where it is, and then take care of it, which seems to be an intelligent approach.
Thank you.
We have a study of government waste. It's called the Grace Commission. It's 10 years old. It's there. Ross Perot, all he has to do is read it and tell us which parts of it he endorses and which parts of it he doesn't endorse. No, he wants to have another study. Then he wants to have an electronic town hall meeting in which he presents these options to the American people and they get to vote on it. That's not being a leader. That's being a television talk show host.
Yeah, I mean, the last caller, that's to say the one from Puerto Rico, did actually genuinely sound apolitical to me. But the one before that from New Hampshire materialized the suspicion I voiced earlier, which is I've so far never met anyone who says I'm not very political, who doesn't turn out to be an extreme conservative.
Certainly not anyone who watches C-SPAN.
What was that, the Jerry Brown 800 number?
426-1112.
1112? And then the Ross Perot number is 800-685-7777. Why did Jerry Brown have such a hard number to remember? Or obviously you remembered it, but I've heard it a number of times and I can't remember.
I don't know why it lodged in my mind. I'm not normally good at numbers.
Why wouldn't you choose 42 Brown or something like that so that there wouldn't be any question that you could
I think Joni Evans's family has this direct marketing firm, and I think that was the only number that was available at the time.
Well, let's clear that up, because I must say I was wondering the same thing.
McLean, Virginia, you're next.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
This is the first time that I have been involved in a political campaign, and I felt very awful when Senator Saunders left the campaign. I also have a number to give, if I'm permitted, and that's Citizens Concerned for Paul Saunders, and it's 1-800-881-TEAM. And what we're trying to do is to see how many votes we can get in each state.
Now, did you say T-E-A-M, team?
T-E-A-M, team.
Team.
1-800-881-TEAM.
All right.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Thanks for calling. What would you both suspect would happen to Senator Saunders in this political campaign and as we go through the conventions? Is he a potential running mate? Could he still win the nomination?
I think he said it best when he said, Governor Clinton and I have fundamental disagreements. I've been through this cancer operation. I'm not interested in politics as usual anymore. If I were Bill Clinton's vice president, I'd have to disagree with him if he came out with a program that I didn't feel was best for the country. I think Saunders should be taken at his word on that. I don't think he's the kind of person to be second banana to anyone.
Mr. Hitchens?
No, I agree with that.
This is Time Magazine this week, and by the way, they've got some behind-the-scenes photos, if I can open them up here. I'll show you one right here. This is Hillary and Bill Clinton, back, I believe, on March the 13th. I looked in this to try to find out who the photographer was, and I haven't been able to find it. Maybe I can find it before the program's over. There's a whole series of photographs in this week's issue.
Looks like the same person who filmed the Madonna movie. So it's Cinema Verite style.
Now, this is, that's James Carville there talking with Governor Clinton. And some other photographs that looks like it may be, I can't tell whether, no, is it on the plane?
Stephanopoulos on the plane, yeah. One on the plane, yes. Looks like it.
Alexandria, Virginia, go ahead, please.
Yes, I am really from Kansas City, but I'm visiting my daughter.
Welcome.
Thank you for your wonderful program.
Thank you.
All right, I started out not liking Clinton for the very reason that you have said this morning, because he was the front runner, and we had never voted, and yet he was going to be the candidate. And then I watched your wonderful New Hampshire coverage, as many of the interviews as possible, the debates, and I have become a real Clinton fan.
What did it for you?
Hearing him speak to the editors. He did an interview with a few people, very off the cuff. I feel like he's a very sincere, knowledgeable man. But, and I hear that the press all like him, then why do they keep saying these terrible, terrible things about him and rude things?
Mr. Hitchens.
I haven't seen many terrible things said about him. I've seen some allegations reported about him. Some of them sort of old hat about girlfriends and so forth. Some of them more suggestive about how he runs his state and how he's been raising his money, and whether or not he knows the difference between one hand and the other when they're washing, in well-known political interface between governors' mansions and businessmen in small states like Arkansas, where you haven't got much to sell but the workforce, and whether or not he had help from his wife in raising dough off BCCI and savings and loan and things of this sort, which are all things that need to be investigated.
There are two things about Bill Clinton. In his favor, I don't think I've ever seen a presidential candidate with such awesome skills at pressing the flesh and convincing people to vote for him. He is the Robopol of American politics.
You might want to reconsider pressing the flesh.
He is the Robopol of American politics. An awesome campaigner. On the other hand, this is a man who wanted to be president from about the age of 16, with the exception of a two-year forced hiatus when he was defeated as governor of Arkansas before he came back. The man has never wanted to be in private life. He has never wanted to be anything but an elected public official. And now he is the quintessential political animal. And I think there's something a little bit dangerous about someone who wanted to be president when he was 16 and who never wanted to serve in any kind of private life, academia, business activity, or anything else. I think that's a terribly limiting political experience. It means that he's certainly very skilled at the nuts and bolts of politics, but perhaps not at anything that has direct connection with the daily lives of the American people.
Here's Newsweek's coverage of the Perot story for this week, calling it the headline "Maverick's Background." Looks like he's on a telephone there. Is that in the boiler room of the non-campaign? La Jolla, California. Go ahead, please. La Jolla, California, you're on the air.
Talking about past people here, Lyndon Johnson, I believe, wanted to be president earlier than the person you're talking about there. To the Englishman, you should have been in California when Jerry Brown was president.
You mean governor?
He called himself governor.
Why?
You know what he did when he was governor? Not much. The only thing you can say about Jerry Brown is that he was better than Ronald Reagan. Talk to the people that are out of work and out of education, courtesy of Jerry Brown, the extreme hypocrite.
No.
He's gone.
He's gone. Well, I don't think the Farm Labor Bill, for example, was nothing in California. It's true, I wasn't there at the time. I was in the state as a visitor. I didn't live in California when he was governor. Farm Labor Bill, not bad. I think his judicial appointments were extremely good, both very thoughtful and very balanced, but showing a real bias in favor of justice.
And one the voters disagreed with and tossed out.
Well, that's true. That's another difference between him and Ronald Reagan. But I mean, these are differences I can live with.
Saratoga, New York.
Yes, I can't, Brian, I listen often, and I try to get through once a month. It's kind of difficult. But I listen to Mr. Fund, the Oracle, stating that Mr. Perot doesn't give an answer, it's an evasion. Perhaps he doesn't understand the language. What the man is saying is start from the base and rebuild. Now, if that's an evasion, God, I don't know the meaning of the word evasion.
Are you, explain to us, are you intrigued by the candidacy at this point, or what? How do you feel about it?
I feel like I'm going to electioneer for him. That's how I feel about it.
Well, now,
and I was a Bush voter, and I was a Reagan voter, and God knows if we continue to let these guys in, they're going to spend us into the poorhouse. My grandkids are going to be paying the bill. Maybe Mr. Hunt isn't aware of that. One thing Mr. Perot says, we the people own the country. If we don't manage it, these guys are running us into a third world nation as rapidly as they can. Is Mr. Fund, is he aware of the bill in front of Congress where they're trying to appropriate the defense money for? Are you aware of that, Mr. Fund?
The
Bill
Defense
HR
Appropriations Bill?
3732.
If it's the Defense Appropriations Bill, I am somewhat aware of it.
Are you aware of it? Do you know what they want to do with it?
Tell us
I'm
what
sure
you're-
you'll tell us.
Yeah, what are you getting at, sir?
Well, Mr. Fund gives the impression that he's a know-all, be-all, and he smirks and it goes on to say that Mr. Perot is just a man that came out of nowhere. The man's a very successful businessman.
All right, let's leave it at that and let Mr. Fund have a chance to. You've used his name 3 or 4 times, Mr. Fund.
I grant Ross Perot his success in business, his integrity. I grant him all of those things. He's a very intelligent person. He's intelligent enough to be very good at the art of politics, much better than he lets on being. He has the ability to appear as a non-politician when I think he is a very political animal. And I think the whole way that this campaign has come about, the whole way that Mr. Perot carefully dances around from the right to the left to the center on various issues shows the mark of a very skillful politician. I'm not for or against Ross Perot. I just believe that his supporters should realize this is very, very, very much a skilled politician.
By the way, I don't know if we can get a real close shot of this, but the Washington Post this morning has a list of all those third-party candidates over the years, going back to the 1800s, and you can see there that the most that any candidate's ever gotten was George Wallace, 9 million plus. What did he get, 46 of 538 electoral votes?
46, you're right.
What does that look like to you when you see that list? Is it possible? I mean, they've never come close, have they?
Wallace had a regional base in the South, which is why he was able to actually win some states. I think Perot would do very well in some states, especially in Texas, where I think there's a lot of disenchantment with George Bush. But again, by October or November, he would probably be down in the John Anderson range of 6 to 8%.
Well, I think we have a one-party system, so I think there must be room for a third because it's high time there was a second. I mean, in other words, there ought to be an opposition party. What I think is likely to happen this year, if the Democrats are beaten again, which I think they will be if they have another business-as-usual, pre-packaged, pollster, ad man candidate, is that there will really be no further need for the Democratic Party. People will really wonder what it's there for. And the answers to that question are frightening to contemplate from the Democratic point of view. Who would start a party like this if they were starting a party now? Nobody would have a party like the Democrats.
Ridgefield, New Jersey. You're next.
I just want to say that I think these two gentlemen are very opinionated.
Supposed
they're
to be.
Speaking about, yeah, but they're speaking about issues and people and candidates that the American public is still making decisions about. These guys have made their decisions. They've decided Ross Perot is essentially a shallow nothing. They've decided that Clinton is not a good, viable candidate just because he's aspired to public office all his life. You know, guys, give us all a break, will you please? Thank you.
What do we do now?
Yeah,
it's a
what
hard
do you
one.
do
It's
now?
very hard to satisfy. They are out there. Well, I mean, I do know, because I spent a lot of time talking back to the TV myself, that it can be very maddening to see opinionated people complacently saying what they think. But there it is, too bad.
What do you think of, this is the cover story in U.S. News and World
Another one.
Report. What do you think of, that photo, or that caricature?
Different.
Any message there they're trying to deliver?
It has a very calculating look in the eye, doesn't it?
And
Very thoughtful look.
the hayseed that he's
Yeah, a hayseed in a city slicker outfit. That's the idea, right?
in a sort of standard issue Hyatt hotel atrium.
Does the Wall Street Journal endorse candidates ever?
We never endorse candidates. Back in the 1920s, one of our editors decided that ideas never disappoint, but candidates always do.
Does Harper's?
Excellent motto. No, Harper's doesn't.
Does The Nation?
Yes. Last time The Nation was for Jesse Jackson.
Who are they for now at this early stage?
Well, there hasn't been an endorsement, but I would certainly think it would go to Governor Brown, and I would argue that it ought to. But we had a public forum in New York City early on, which the Nation Institute sponsored at New York University, and that was at a time when, if you remember, every pundit in the land was saying that the Brown candidacy was a joke in itself.
You know, Brian, it is interesting that in this election year, people on the right and the left actually come together in agreement on a lot of issues. We both agree that American politics is sterile and hollow. We both agree that the Congress is completely unrepresentative of the American people. We both agree that there needs to be some fundamental debate in this country, either from a third political force or from within the parties. So it's ironic that the only people who seem to be disenfranchised are the kind of people, the average Americans who call in about Ross Perot, and I can sympathize with their opinions, and people who actually believe in something, who believe in an ideological program, who believe that politics should stand for ideas and not just getting elected. It's astonishing that there's agreement on the far right and the far left and all points in the middle, except for the center, and sort of the bland political consultants and the pollsters who basically program these candidates.
Santa Monica, California.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Hi, this is only the second time I've got through in 10 years, so be kind and gentle, please.
Try to be.
Okay, first I wanted to tell Mr. Hitchens that when he spoke, I heard him on Pacifica Station, KPFK out here. He gave a thoroughgoing analysis of what would have to be done to make the American electoral system work. He was comparing it in some respects to the British. Government-funded TV, very limited campaigns, no cash cows. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, sure, the day that Congress votes for something like that will be a cold winter's day. But I think basically Ross Perot or anybody else, it's all pretty moot until campaign financing and campaign management is totally overhauled. The second thing is Mr. Fun was jumping all over a caller who was for Perot because Perot had simplistic answers. I believe I'm paraphrasing him. One of the things Perot said that interested me was precisely this engineering approach. Strip it down, take it apart, see what works. He was specific about certain programs. For example, the health care crisis. He said run pilot programs for different kinds of health care programs in different parts of the country and see what works, which sounds so much more sensible than blindly stabbing at one decision and then having it flounder. At this point, I'm so ABB, anybody but Bush, that I'm even thinking about writing in Barbara Boxer, who's running for Senate from California. But I would consider Perot. I agree with Mr. Fund. He should come out with more specifics. But I strongly disagree that the engineering approach is defective. I think it's good and analytical, and we ought to have more of that in Washington.
All right, thanks.
I believe in the engineering approach to analyzing problems. But when you say we should run pilot programs on health care, as Mr. Perot does, we have all of the pilot programs in the world that we want to choose from. We've got Britain, we've got Germany, we've got Canada, we've got Oregon's managed care system. We have dozens of pilot programs to choose from. If Mr. Perot hasn't bothered to peruse those and figure out which one he likes best, then he is not being completely forthcoming. It's a way to evade the question and not tell the American people what kind of health care program he wants.
I must say I'm impressed by the number of people who are calling in this way. I'm just trying to think about it now. I mean, if I was a Bush type watching this show, what would I be thinking? I mean, they are people prepared to do anything you need to do to get elected. They like to pose as non-political, as patriotic, as good managers, all this kind of thing. They're hearing their own rhetoric in a way played back to them by people who say, well, in that case, in effect, why not have the country turned over to the Chamber of Commerce or to a smart businessman? But there is something about this whatever will work politics that I've got to say I find rather sinister. It would mean there was really no road at all for the discussion of ideas. It would merely be a competition of pragmatisms.
The danger here for George Bush is most of these people who are calling in, I suspect, either voted for him or were considering voting for him again this year until Mr. Perot came on the scene. I think George Bush could lose several large states if Mr. Perot ran. And if I were the Bush people, I'd be talking to Mr. Perot and finding out exactly what he wanted right now.
Pawtucket, Rhode Island, you're next.
Hi, I just wanted to say I really love C-SPAN. I've been watching it for a few years now, and I find it very addictive.
Thank you for calling.
But on one comment I'd wanted to make, okay, I can understand the reporters being opinionated, but I want to know why. I never hear the in-depth investigations going on into President Bush's background, and I've never heard anybody even discussing Vice President Quayle's infidelity a few years ago, which was briefly mentioned during the last election.
Thanks. Mr. Hitchens.
Well, I think it was, in the case of Vice President Quayle, it was mentioned in order to be dismissed. It was a false allegation involving a lobbyist, actually. It would have been more interesting to know what he was doing with the lobbyist, rather, doing with her in her capacity as a lobbyist than in her capacity as, I think her name was Paula Parkinson, the bimbette. If you mean what I think you mean about the president, what you think is that he should be asked the same question almost every other candidate has now been asked, which is, have you ever? And as a matter of fact, he once did deny that through his son to Newsweek magazine in a profile. He got his son to ring them up and say, if you want to ask about the adultery question, the answer is no. Making me curious from that day to this one, what life is like in the Bush family. I mean, how does the son know? And how does the father tell the son to call up a news magazine and say, it's not the case? It gives a strange picture of life around the Bush hearth. I think, anyway, there's no reason Bush shouldn't be asked.
I want to show you a Morton Kondracki piece. He writes for both New Republican Roll Call, and this is a roll call piece from today. It's Pennsylvania Avenue is the name of the piece, and there's just a couple of headlines that stick out. One on one side says, Clinton versus Bush, dirtiest campaign in over a century, question mark. And the other side, it says, Clinton aides are encouraging reporters to revisit ancient and never substantiated rumors about extramarital activity by George Bush. And they have a little cartoon in the middle that shows a couple of bucket brigades here, probably full of mud. What do you think of this, John Fun?
I think the campaign they're referring to is probably the election of 1884, where a Republican with significant corporate support and a somewhat lackluster record campaigned against Grover Cleveland, who had fathered an illegitimate child. And there was the famous slogan, "Ma, Ma, where's my paw?" It was a vicious campaign, very closely contested. It came down to a few votes in New York. Grover Cleveland won by just a few thousand votes. And of course, the retort of his supporters then was, "Ma, Ma, where's my paw? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." That's probably the campaign reference they're making there.
But will this be the dirtiest campaign since then?
It looks like that.
What about the personal side of this? They're suggesting here that Clinton aides are encouraging reporters to revisit ancient and never substantiated rumors about extramarital activity by George Bush.
I believe in a division of labor in journalism. I leave that franchise to the National Star.
The fact is that the woman in question, the one everyone wants to know about, is on the government payroll. So it would have the same implication for the president as the Flowers flap had in Arkansas, that it was not just a matter of dalliance, but also a matter of rewards for dalliance and so on. The difference will be, and probably for that reason, that we won't get the lady to say that it's true. More I probably shouldn't say. I'm very tempted to. It's strange. Everyone in this studio, I think, knows her name. Certainly everyone I know in Washington knows her name. No one outside Washington does.
Well, in fairness, let me just tell you that something you may not know, that 3 times in 1 week on this network, 3 different reporters out there on the panels that we were covering did mention her name.
Really? It's interesting. That makes you very different from the other networks and from the mainstream press, because
makes them lie, for one thing.
Yes.
Well, it was spontaneous, and we don't edit anything, so
Right.
there it was, and there were some horror-struck faces on some of the panels.
See, I have no reason to think it's true. I mean, I have no reason to think it's untrue either. What I do find uncomfortable is a situation where everyone in Washington knows and can know, and people outside wonder what the hell is being talked about. But anyway, if it's been done, I won't be daring and be the first to do it.
Boston, Massachusetts. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Brian, this is my first call, so I hope you'll be patient with me.
Welcome.
I've been listening to Mr. Fund and Mr. Hitchens and their skepticism about Mr. Perot, stating that the man is evasive and all that jazz. I wonder if they listened to his speech and question and answers on the National Press Club last Wednesday. I don't find Mr. Perot evasive at all. I find him straightforward, and my first choice had been Mr. Tsongas. I'm sorry he stepped out. My second choice will definitely be Mr. Perot if he's on the ballot. Thank you very much.
Well, don't go away. What is it about him? What's the first thing? I mean,
I like the way he talks. I like what he says to you. I don't like Mr. Clinton. I compare him as a carnival barker who talks and talks and talks, never lets you get a word in edgewise, and gives you nothing in the long run.
All right, thanks for calling. Now, this is a woman that said she voted for Paul Tsongas. You earlier said it would be...
I think that Mr. Perot would get about 60% of his votes from Bush supporters and about 40% from people who would otherwise vote for Clinton or a Democrat. But in a close race, and this will be a very, very close race, I think we'll be up till 4 o'clock in the morning on election night. I think it could tip the election to the Democrat.
Tsongas was also a businessman's candidate after all as well. He basically said, you know, what we need, and he wondered why he had to run as a Democrat to say this. What we need is to, you know, let the corporations have their way. A lot of people believe this. A lot of people think if the country could be run like a corporation, everything would be fine. I don't know many of these people work for corporations themselves. But anyway, it's a common fallacy. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, though. I'm going to find out more about this guy, Perot, after this morning. I mean, I've clearly been not paying attention. And I make that self-criticism. I should have gone to the National Press Club. I meant to. I didn't. I'm going to catch up with this.
Well, the
because they
all you
are
have to do is
apparently
watch
out
on
there.
C-SPAN.
Well,
They
watch
cover
on C-SPAN.
everything.
Seal Beach, California. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
Brian, it took Reagan and Bush to destroy the air controllers and bust their union. When they did that, I told all the businessmen in the world, you can do anything you want, boys. Go right ahead. Now, they started to do that. Harry Truman said, if you left this place up to the Republicans, they would scar this country from end to end with concrete. And that seems to be what's going on. All I want to know from the people are we going to take the country back? Or are we going to live with what's going on? It's just like fighting the war. I supported the war because I thought it was important, not for oil, but for people. Also, Brian, I've watched you a long time now. I would just like you and your cohorts to answer a few questions yourselves. You guys are intelligent. You know, give us a few answers.
Like to what?
Just say something that you think for a change, Brian. My oldest daughter keeps saying, if she has to get up and watch you, at least she wants to hear what comes out of your mouth. You can tell what goes on with some of your questions, how you might think maybe on the conservative side, and with a few of your cohorts, they might be on the liberal side. But believe it or not, Brian, we're interested in what you got to say, too.
Thanks. I hope it'll never happen. I may lose control here someday.
Eventually, you're going to be a victim of celebrity journalism, Brian. It's coming. It's coming.
You don't have to give. You still don't have to. I mean, that's not our role here. And I'm sorry that your daughter's upset. But if I started to give opinions here, then there'd be more people upset than there are now. Yes.
Yes, there would be too. Well, now I feel crushed that I don't seem to have been opinionated enough. But I'm ready to field a question from Seal Beach or anywhere else.
Let me, because this is the last time you were here, Morton Kondracki was sitting across from me. It was a little different
yes,
chemistry.
Right. Yes.
Let me ask you both, though, before we grab this next call. What do you feel strongest about today? What can get your ire up? What can really get you frosted?
God, I really ought to have an instant answer to that. And it would be no disgrace if I did. But
are you angry? I mean,
well, I have just lately. I have just been very annoyed by the professionalization of politics, by the manipulation of the pollsters and the money men and so forth, and very annoyed with my own profession for apparently playing along with this and echoing it and being in a sense a part of it. And if you ask me what I've been most exercised about lately, that's it. But I'm aware that sounds incredibly trivial. Can I tread water for a minute while?
Yeah, we'll come back. We got a call. Let me just ask. Let me ask you.
I mean, I must be able to do better than that.
John Fund, what are you most angry about? What are you most opinionated about?
I've been covering Congress for 4 or 5 years, and I thought I couldn't become more cynical about Congress. But the House bank scandal, the House post office scandal, the House restaurant scandal, and the attitudes that they betray, in and of themselves, these scandals are not major, but I think they reveal the basic corruption at the heart of Congress. And I think when the American people finally figure out how this place was run, they're going to be even more upset than they are now.
Here's a chart in this morning's Washington Post about how a check moves through the whole process over on Capitol Hill. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that people have been calling about is down here, the Riggs Bank. And the bank does fit into the middle of all this, where it makes sure they don't run out of money. Decatur, Georgia, go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm a first-time caller. And I'd like to tell you that I'm for Ross Perot. I'm a black female. And I noticed that your panel, well, what he impresses me with first is his truthfulness and how fair he is. Now, as far as your two newspaper men seem to be concerned about his position on the issues. I don't think they get it. The man said that he's going to create an electronic way to communicate with the voters, and that he would take his positions from the people. He wants to be the servant. Now, the second point I wanted to bring up was the reporters didn't get it when the people revolted and tore down the Soviet Union. Reporters didn't get it when the people eliminated the Berlin Wall. And I don't think reporters are going to get it what the people are thinking in America. And I can't wait for Mr. Perot to run.
Thank you.
I agree that it would be nice if politicians were the servants of the people. Unfortunately, that's not the kind of system we have. We have a representative form of government. I frankly believe in national voter referendums. I believe in none of the above ballot options. I believe in a lot of things which I think would empower people more than they are now at the ballot box. But for Ross Perot to go on and on about having an electronic town hall meeting every night in which he would take his positions from the American people, sift through them, and then decide what he was going to do, that's basically what you're talking about, is taking a C-SPAN show, distilling all of the phone calls, and figuring out what you're going to do. That is not a realistic program. It sounds good, it sounds catchy, but he's going to have to come up with something more between now and October.
Why is it not realistic?
Well, Brian, imagine you're president, and you sit here with all of the calls coming in from C-SPAN, and you're supposed to distill the collected wisdom of the American people, and I believe they are wise, and make up your mind. From the calls we've gotten today, what consensus would you draw? I suspect you'd have difficulty coming up with a consensus.
Mr. Hitchens.
Well, and furthermore, I mean, this is what George Gallup says, this, if I can advert to my own piece in Harper's again. That's what George Gallup said when he launched the idea of the opinion poll, that it would be one big town meeting and everyone under the same tent, and what he called the sampling referendum, which was his founding name for the idea of the opinion poll, would decide. And then we'd have the perfect means of having democracy between elections. What was pointed out to him, although he paid no attention, was that these meetings, it's very important who the chairman is, and who wields the gavel, and who asks what question, and how the question is phrased. And what you can get very easily indeed, if you're not careful, or even if you are, is a system wide open to manipulation.
And the
For
illusion
example,
of popular sovereignty.
the illusion of, combined with a phony feeling on people's part that they are a part of it, they've participated. It's like being asked to take part in TV ratings or something.
Well, it would look like something out of the movie Network, where Howard Beale is saying, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to put up with it anymore, and pretending that he's speaking for the rest of the population when he's really not.
I thought it was a real disgrace, for example, that CBS, after the State of the Union speech, asked people to phone in their own vote and published the results as if it was a serious thing.
And made money on the deal.
And for money, such a clearly phony thing to do, and so open to actually very crude abuse of people ringing more than once, but every other kind of abuse too.
In April's issue of Harper's is the article on polling by Christopher Hitchens. I know you don't like to do this, but didn't you write the longest editorial on this morning's Wall Street Journal? For those of you who, it's the second editorial on the editorial page, if you want to see how John Fund writes, although many times you can see him on this page with his byline. Let's go to Gainesville, Florida. You're next. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on, to be able to get through. I've been trying, I guess, for about a year, and I would like to say I enjoy the show very much, Brian, and also to Chris, that his commentary is terrific. He's a very gutsy guy, and he tells it like it is. Not to take anything away from the other gentleman, because I'm not really that familiar with him. But what I would like to say is the political process in this country, the whole thing that's going on is just absolutely incredible. The things that we get sucker punched with, election after election, where we can take a person that probably has some credibility and knock him out of the race completely. The whole process, to me, doesn't seem to function anymore. It seems to be why we're in the problem and in the situation that we're in. Obviously, I'm going to show my party affiliation if I haven't at this point. But how many times do we have to hear the reactive things that the president does? He's not a visionary. We need somebody that's capable of independent thinking, that's capable of doing something with this country, that has the competence and the necessities, the things that he has to do to move this country ahead. And it's almost like the electorate is brain damaged, that we can go through this over and over again, and it just goes on and on and on. When does it ever end?
All right, thanks. Think about that a second. I want to make sure if our producers can, let's try to get Kurt Koenig back again. Twice now I've dropped him off the air, and his line was busy earlier. Do you have a reaction to our caller?
Again, it just shows the basic frustration with most of the American electorate in this year. They don't feel there are any real choices. They feel as if people are not speaking honestly and directly to them. And I think we're going to see an upheaval in Congress and a very, very close presidential election because people are going to be dissatisfied with both major candidates.
The Newsweek poll this week shows 48% for Bush, for President Bush, 44% for Governor Clinton at this point. Do these polls mean anything?
That poll certainly doesn't mean a damn thing.
Why not?
Well, because Clinton isn't a nominee yet, for one thing. For another, I mean, this time, 4 years ago, Michael Dukakis was 18 points in the lead, according to every opinion poll. Put it like that. That's all you really need to remember.
Why do these organizations do these kind of polls then?
Well, they make a lot of money. I mean,
Newsweek. Why would Newsweek put this in?
It's an interesting way of apparently covering the news without having to commit yourself. It's another bad effect it has on the press, I think, is an opinion poll is always a piece of news, but you've actually gone out and made it. You haven't gone out and found it. And it's perfect because it's apparently neutral. It doesn't commit you to anything. Bush surges in poll isn't apparently a value judgment.
Pasadena, California. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. Just as a favor, could you try to get someone on, please, from AT&T to explain why they cut us off after 4 minutes? I've tried to work my way through the labyrinth to protest about it, and I can't get them to answer the question. I think essentially they just want us to pay for the time on the line while we're ringing rather than just wait for you to answer. But I'd love to hear someone from AT&T talk about it.
Right. Do you use AT&T long distance?
Well, this time, no, I didn't. I called and got a Sprint line, and so I'm calling on a Sprint line even though I'm registered with AT&T. But it's very maddening to finally get a line through and then lose it after 4 minutes.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for the suggestion. We'll try to do that.
Okay. And to paraphrase the callers of the last couple of weeks from Texas and Minnesota, please ignore that caller from Palmdale a few minutes ago, the 30-day violator. She feels very strongly about Clinton, I know, but in sabotaging Jerry Brown, I think people forget that he was excellent and innovative. When people first started calling him Governor Moonbeam, it was only because he wanted to have California's own satellite, which makes perfect sense since we don't have even a radio station that goes from Northern California to Southern California. But what I really want to say is that Ross Perot is intriguing, and I followed him on C-SPAN for the past couple of years, and I've listened carefully because I had always imagined that he was very, very far right-wing, and I'm extremely liberal. And he's incredibly appealing. In the past year, the politics of left and right sort of merged at about the time of the war, at which time Buchanan took on the Israeli lobby in this country. Bill Clinton is very much a product of that. In fact, I would almost vote for George Bush for standing up to them. But now Ross Perot even says he'll stand up to the NRA. He's going to take them on as well. I don't know. I think it's very intriguing. Anyway, I've called Ross Perot's number. Christopher, I hope that you follow up and see what you think about it. I'd be interested to read about it.
This is a fascinating call because it shows that Ross Perot has successfully convinced a liberal that he's more or less on her side. Ross Perot is, I don't think, easily pinned down on his ideology. He dances from left to right to center and back and forth. And he's doing it successfully enough that you're getting dozens of callers from all kinds of points in the political spectrum who think he speaks for them, when actually we don't know who he speaks for.
Let me, Chris Hitchens, do you have a response?
Well, it's beginning to really impress me that this is the case, but I can't repress a feeling of alarm and disquiet about it. I mean, in other words, I think the Perot surge, if that is what indeed it is a real judgment on the political degeneration that's taking place before our eyes. The people look at politics and they see nothing.
Pasadena, any response?
No, well, I'm interested. Furthermore, you know, the other thing about Ross Perot and that you brought out, he got quite heated up about it. And the interview you did with him, Brian, was that he was very down on the shenanigans of the Reagan White House, a la Ollie North, and the nonsense that went on. I mean, the devastating lethal nonsense that went on with the CIA, I have the feeling that he could take a broom to that business, too. Let's just be straight ahead.
All right, thanks.
So you'd love to see that.
Kurt Koenig, you're back with us?
Yes, Brian, I'm here.
I think you're going to think that this is on purpose. I swear to, I don't know what's happening. Anyway, what's happened in the last hour or so? You got any calls?
Quite a number. I think Sarah had a difficult time getting back to me.
I know she did. Listen, before really what I wanted to ask you is tell us something about you. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Where do you come from? Where do you go to school? And what what do you do for a living? Because I know we've been talking to you the last couple of weeks.
I guess we'll start at the beginning. I'm a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. I registered as a Republican back in the first presidential election that I was able to vote in. It was when John Anderson was running on the Republican ticket against Ronald Reagan, and I signed up as a Republican so I could vote for John Anderson in the primary. I went on to vote for John Anderson as a independent, and I guess the last notable vote I cast was for George Bush. I felt that it was important that a Republican be in the presidency when all of the mistakes of the last decade finally caught up to us. I thought it was only fair that a Republican get the blame.
That Republican decade needed another Republican to clear it up, you mean?
Yeah. Well, if it was a Democrat in there, it would have been the Republican.
Do you always think as logically as that politically, or do you just always vote Republican?
No, sir. No, sir. As I said, my first time I voted in the Republican primary, but I voted for John Anderson on the independent ticket.
John Anderson, the guy who wanted there to be a constitutional amendment making the United States a Christian country?
I don't even
or some
think
other
it mattered
John
to
Anderson.
me at the point what he was running on. The idea that the reason for my voting there was I felt it was important that this country have a third alternative and not just the
third Republican alternative.
A third alternative, regardless of party line. As a matter of fact, I think one of the.
You said you registered as a Republican to vote for him.
Yes, in the primary, in the Republican primary, he was running in the Republican primary.
What's happened to Anderson? You see, there's another of these characters everyone thinks, I'll go for Anderson because of his integrity, he's new, he tells it like it is. Actually a complete loony and a non-entity, a mediocrity. He then took one shot at it and completely disappeared, out of politics.
Kurt
Never
Koenig,
another word out of it.
We're going to check back with you later on and see how this thing's going. I just wanted to get some of that background information. Thanks for being so patient.
And Anderson, the Christianity Amendment.
We need to go to Elk City, Oklahoma. We're running out of time. We got some calls to get in here. Go ahead, Elk City.
I want to make just make a remark. It concerns George Bush. When is the people going to wake up the man just isn't qualified to be president? We have had a president that's flew to every country in the world except ours for 3 years. Now he's going back to the White House trying to convince the people that he's a good president for them. What's your comment on this?
Caller, did you know that he's been to all 50 states since he's been president?
Yes, over about 10 minutes each, probably.
All right, thanks. Mr. Fund?
George Bush is qualified to be president. Most Americans of any sense, I think, are qualified to be president in the kind of country and the kind of government we should have, which, frankly, politics is a lot less complicated than it appears to be. And I think that the way that we reform it is introduce things like national voter referendums and other things which would have the effect of real direct democracy.
Palo Alto, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I'm calling with a question for Christopher Hitchens. I follow your work in The Nation and elsewhere, and I like it very much.
Thank you.
But I'm a little bit worried after listening to your position on Jerry Brown. I think you may have lost your moorings in the United States political system or something, because Jerry Brown, I mean, certainly there are some laudable aspects to his program, but I think that you dismissed the caller earlier who complained about Brown's performance in California a little too quickly. For example, the famous flip-flop on Prop 13, I think, is still reflected in what he's doing right now with his tax reform system. And what I'm hearing in what you're saying is a kind of repeat of the whole idea that we should support a Democrat, you know, because it's the lesser of two evils.
Oh, good God, no, if I sounded like that, I would apologize. Look, this may sound a bit glib by way of reply, and we haven't got a lot of time, but it is my understanding that Brown is running against his own record in California and everywhere else. So the people who say he wasn't that great then and so on are, you may say, okay, it's too easy for him to do this, but at least he is saying, I've been there, I was right in there at the heart of the system, grubbing around like a hog, and now I'm running against that style of politics. So it was that way of talking that drew me to him. Second, I have to admit, I do have an ideological temptation for the libertarians. And quite a lot of people on the left come around to considerations of the libertarian position, especially in political economy. And it's an intriguing synthesis, and I'd want it done by a trustworthy person. And I like the way that Brown has allowed people to think about that synthesis anyway.
Last call for our guest, Annandale, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. I'm very nervous, first-time caller.
Okay.
I just would like to say to Mr. Fun, he said that trying to get an idea of how people should feel, how they should vote, the idea of electronic town hall, is like getting the feeling from C-SPAN. Well, it's right there. The people are getting behind Perot, and if we can get these numbers out big time, we're going to see a new man in Washington.
Thank you.
I'm impressed by the show of support for Ross Perot. However, that's no substitute for a program. And I don't believe the American people ultimately want to vote for someone simply on the basis of his integrity, with lacking a program.
I probably shouldn't do this. I want to ask the question of Christopher Hitchens and John Fund. Which one of these covers this week do you think will sell the most? It's this Garth Brooks. Whoops, we lost this one on Mr. Clinton and on Newsweek.
Garth Brooks.
Why?
It makes a change, and it's all about country music, isn't it, and things like that.
Country music is the most popular music format in the nation, and Garth Brooks is probably a much more interesting character than Bill Clinton when it comes right down to it.
By the way, this cover in Newsweek was taken by, I believe, Eddie Adams. Any of you photography experts know whether... And they do have...
Unless he's related to Ansel Adams, and I doubt it.
And they do have a new slick cover this week. Yes, Mr.
See,
Hitchens.
I'm wondering if Perot was on television less, or hadn't been on so recently, whether we'd get all this kind of support. I'm wondering if, in other words, this isn't just a hum, sort of an immediate media rush, whether, you know, if the guy from Wayne's World wasn't suddenly saying, you know, I'd make a better president than Bush, you wouldn't get just as many people saying, yeah, I think you would. I certainly do think the guy from Wayne's World would be a better president than George Bush.
Christopher Hitchens is a columnist with The Nation, and your publisher, Mr. Carter, will be on here Wednesday.
Oh.
9 o'clock Wednesday morning. And also is the Washington editor of Harper's, where he has an April issue front page piece, or noted on the front page, Voting in the Passive Voice. Mr. Hitchens is originally from Portsmouth, England, and went to school at Cambridge, graduated in philosophy, politics, and economics, Oxford University in 1970. And Mr. John Fund, editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, is originally from Sacramento, California, graduated from Cal State University, where? Sacramento in journalism and economics, and has been at the Dow Jones organization since 1984, I believe, and has been writing editorials since 1986. Thank you both very much for joining us as we kick off this week. And to our audience, have a nice day. John Fund, editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal. How do you see the presidential campaign at this moment in history?
I don't think it's over quite yet. I think Bill Clinton has more or less wrapped up the nomination, but I think Jerry Brown is going to bloody him for the next 3 or 4 months.
How would you rate this campaign as campaigns go?
Actually fairly substantive. I mean, when you have 5 candidates producing their own 90-page booklets on how to repair the economy, that's real meat.
Christopher and Alexander Hitchens. Good morning.
Good morning. Spring break.
Now, what is going on here? What are you two doing together?
He's fed up of just seeing his daddy on TV. He wants to...
He wants to be on TV?
He wants to be on TV.
This is spring break at
and
school?
This is spring break, and this is for all the teachers who thought that they wouldn't have to see him today, because I know that, like all serious people, they're C-SPAN watchers. He's back. Okay.
Now, what does he think? Does he have... do you want to tell us what you think of the campaign? Are you watching the presidential campaign?
Sometimes.
Who's your favorite candidate?
No prompting.
Alexander, do you have a favorite candidate?
Yeah.
Who?
Governor Brown.
Governor Brown.
Who's your least favorite candidate?
Bush.
Very good.
I see. Well, thank you.
Thank
you for coming. We'll check in with you later. And now, Mr. Hitchens.
PC kid.
Why were you whispering in your child's ear? Is he not able to make up his own mind?
No, you noticed the Bush was unprompted completely. It's depressing for the customers to begin by agreeing with the Journal and so on, but I think that's exactly right. I think it's amazing that people are telling the residents of New York City, of the great state of California, of this very jurisdiction where we're sitting, D.C., who haven't voted yet, why have an election? We already have a candidate for you. And I'm sure there's a lot of resistance to this. And I also agree that Governor Brown is going to be the beneficiary of it. So this is a terrible way to kick off, isn't it?
Great minds think alike.
Let me go, though, to an international story this morning as a way of getting your feelings about what's going on around the world. The headline of the Washington Post I'm looking at, I'll show the audience in a moment, is Socialists Crushed in France. Anti-foreigner right environmentalists make election gains. Have you looked at this election, and what does it mean, if anything, for this country?
Well, it means the Socialist Party has been in power for too long, almost 10 years, and the voters are exacting some revenge. But remember, this is not the election that determines the French government. It determines the regional and provincial governments. So people are free to cast a protest vote, which is why you see the ecologists and Jean-Marie Le Pen's anti-immigrant party doing very well. They would not do quite as well in the national election that would determine the government.
Do you still consider yourself a socialist?
Yes, I do.
What do you think when you see the socialists only getting 20% of the vote in France and the Jean-Marie Le Pen group getting 14%?
Well, I mean, partly because I'm a socialist, I can't stand François Mitterrand or his choice of prime minister, and I think it's a verdict on that. I mean, when I look at Mitterrand, I see the guy actually who murdered the crew of the Greenpeace vessel in New Zealand, for example. I mean, who's always placed his own ego and the sacred ego of French national interest above any consideration of principle. I wish that was why he was losing. I'm afraid it's not. I think it's obviously true that there's a new frontier being created in Europe, a Mediterranean frontier, which separates southern Europe, the southern flank of the common market, from the northern tier of Africa. And it's becoming a zone of contestation, and people talk about it as if it was a frontier, not unlike the Rio Grande, on a giant scale.
Will the election on April the 9th in Great Britain have any impact on American politics, or will be any indication of which way this country will go?
Yes. I think they've tracked each other pretty closely.
That long. And then to say, oh yeah, now I think about it, that's a mistake, as if it hadn't occurred to him before, is pretty depressing too. But there seems to be a Teflon character to Governor Clinton, which means these sort of things don't get held against him. I said Brown because you're just holding up the front of the New York Times with him on the cover.
I was looking for a photograph. One of those papers this morning has a picture of Governor Clinton at the golf club last week.
Oh.
And this is a front page story in the New York Times this morning. It says, Brown in New York assails Clinton with a new ferocity.
And that was about the golf club, among other things, wasn't it?
It's about a lot of things.
I am astonished at how people in the Democratic establishment have taken a figure like Governor Brown and vilified him. I certainly think he's eccentric. I certainly think he's occasionally irresponsible in his rhetoric. He certainly is a consummate political opportunist. But he is a legitimate candidate. And for Democratic officials to call him, quote, the political equivalent of a drive-by shooting, unquote, is a bit unfair. I think he does have a distinct political program from Governor Clinton, and I think it's a mistake for Democrats to belittle him, because I think a lot of his voters might sit home in the fall.
Front page of the New York Times yesterday, there's another photograph I want to ask you both about. Mr. Hitchens.
Doesn't he look adorable? Don't they both look adorable? Buchanan and Nixon.
Yes.
Well, everyone else seems to ask President Nixon's advice on everything. Why shouldn't Buchanan? At least with Buchanan, the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree.
Mr. Fun.
I think it's appropriate. I think it's Buchanan looking for some stature. I think it reminds people that he's worked for at least 2 presidents. But Buchanan is now running for 1996. He's not running for this year. And that's obvious.
Before we leave that Brown photograph, I'll just say, great predecessor of mine at Harper's, the late Walter Karp, used to say that the Democratic...
He's played those cards fairly well, with the exception of completely missing the boat on the rise of nationalism in Eastern Europe and Russia and the other republics. He was way behind on that, and frankly, he was extremely lucky that Gorbachev left office as quietly as he did. Yeltsin managed to fill that gap. It could have blown up in his face. That famous Chicken Kiev speech of last year was a disgrace, and he's lucky that everyone has forgotten it.
Symbols and photographs are always interesting. Here's the Washington Times, and here's a photograph from yesterday. You see 3 well-known national candidates there. Christopher Hitchens, what comes to mind when you see that?
Which way is Jesse leaning, I suppose, is the sort of hidden subtext of the photograph.
Whose idea do you think that is? That they all 3 get together?
it's clever enough for it to be Jackson's idea, I think. Clever in the sense of, you know, image politics. I mean, he's in a position at the moment where Governor Brown has said he would consider him as a running mate, and Governor Clinton is, for the moment, running as the friend of the black American. And with New York coming up, I imagine he's able to pretty much name his price. I have a feeling, though, that he's worth less as a symbol than he once was. I think he's disappointed a lot of his supporters very greatly.
John Funn, when you see this photograph, what comes to mind?
I think it's Jesse Jackson taking bids for his support. And it's also a way of showing that Bill Clinton and Jesse Jackson get along just fine, despite Governor Clinton's outburst when he was mistakenly informed that Jackson endorsed another candidate.
Which I'd forgotten, right. And despite the fact also that Governor Clinton was found to play golf at an all-white club in Arkansas, which I must say I think is astounding for someone who's been a governor of a state like that.
Over the years. I think if Labor wins, and it's ahead by 1 or 2 points in the polls now, there's a very good chance that the Democrat would beat Bush. In any event, both elections are going to be very, very close.
What do you think?
Well, I think there's always been a zeitgeist effect of the British election, and obviously, very noticeably in '79, Thatcherism made Reaganism just look, I hate the word, but more electable. I promise I will not use that word again today, but it showed that you could run a successful populist campaign from the right. The Conservatives didn't have to pretend to be centrists to get elected. And I think that did have a boosting effect on Reagan. I don't actually think Kinnock would have a very boosting effect on anyone. But I think the defeat of post-Thatcherism might be a warning to the post-Reaganites that it's quite difficult to remake a conservative administration.
Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, was in town over the weekend, had a press conference with the president in the East Room. Some say he endorsed the president's re-election in a kind of a roundabout way, saying how well he had done in foreign affairs. What does that mean?
I just think that German leaders, like leaders all over Europe, admire stability. They like the guy who's in there now. They don't like the unknown. And so Kohl is just going with that which is familiar. No news there.
Dear, oh dear, I'm afraid that's true. I agree. Though, I mean, I think it deserves to be said, perhaps this early in the show, that this giving to Bush, of all the credit about foreign policy, of saying, okay, let's let him have that, fine, now let's get on with discussing politics, is a real sign of underdevelopment, don't you think? I mean, for one thing, it avoids him having to ever answer any questions about a foreign policy that's distinctly iffy.
Bush has been the beneficiary of a great deal of luck. But